I want to tell you about a conversation that took place in Brussels in 2015 during the height of the Greek debt crisis. I was sitting across from Wolfgang Schäuble, Germany's finance minister, a man who had spent decades building what he believed was European sovereignty. The irony was crushing. Here was the architect of European integration, the champion of fiscal discipline, the defender of the European project, and he was explaining to me why Greece had to accept terms dictated not by European institutions, but by the International Monetary Fund, an American-dominated organization that Europeans had originally created the Eurozone to escape. That moment crystallized something I had been struggling to understand throughout my time as finance minister. Europe doesn't lack the economic power to assert independence from the United States. It doesn't lack the political institutions or the legal framework. What Europe lacks is something more fundamental, the willingness to pay the price that genuine sovereignty requires. Because make no mistake, breaking free from American hegemony is possible, but it demands sacrifices that European elites have spent 70 years learning to avoid. Let me start with the economics, because the numbers tell a story that political rhetoric obscures. The European Union's combined GDP exceeds $17 trillion compared to $25 trillion for the United States. Europe's population is 450 million versus 330 million for America. European corporations dominate global markets in automobiles, luxury goods, pharmaceuticals, industrial machinery. European banks, despite their problems, remain among the largest in the world. By any conventional measure of economic power, Europe should be America's equal, not its subordinate. Yet when the United States imposed sanctions on Russia in 2022, European companies immediately complied, even when those sanctions directly harmed European economic interests. When America banned Huawei from its telecommunications networks, European nations followed suit, abandoning what many considered superior technology. When Washington pressured Europe to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP, European governments scrambled to meet American demands, redirecting resources from social programs and infrastructure investment. This isn't the behavior of sovereign equals. This is the behavior of satellites, and understanding why requires examining the architecture of dependence that has been carefully constructed since 1945. The foundation of European subordination isn't military, though NATO plays a crucial role. It's monetary. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, made the dollar the world's reserve currency, but it did something more subtle and more profound. It made the American financial system the central nervous system of global capitalism. When that system was modified after 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window and the dollar became a pure fiat currency, Europe faced a choice: build an alternative system or accept permanent subordination. Europe chose subordination, but with a twist. Rather than explicitly acknowledging American monetary hegemony, European leaders convinced themselves they were building something different. The European monetary system, launched in 1979, was supposed to create monetary stability independent of the dollar. The euro, introduced in 1999, was supposed to challenge dollar dominance in international trade and finance. These weren't foolish aspirations. In theory, a unified European currency backed by the world's largest trading bloc could indeed rival the dollar. But theory collided with reality in 2008, and reality won decisively. When the global financial crisis hit, European banks discovered they were just as exposed to American subprime mortgages as their American counterparts. More importantly, they discovered that their access to dollar funding, essential for international operations, depended entirely on the Federal Reserve's willingness to provide it. The Fed opened swap lines with the European Central Bank, providing unlimited dollars to European banks. But this wasn't generosity, it was dependency management. I watched this dynamic play out firsthand during the Greek crisis. The European Central Bank could print euros, but it couldn't print dollars, and much of European banking was dollarized in ways that weren't immediately visible. When liquidity dried up, European banks needed dollar funding, and only the Fed could provide it. This gave the United States effective veto power over European monetary policy, a power it exercised subtly but decisively. The Americans didn't dictate specific policies. They didn't need to. They simply made it clear that European banking stability depended on American cooperation, and that cooperation had conditions: support for American sanctions regimes, adoption of American financial regulations, acceptance of American oversight over international transactions. The troika that imposed austerity on Greece included the IMF, not because Europeans wanted it there, but because the institutional framework required it. This brings us to the second pillar of dependence, the technological infrastructure of modern finance. When Europeans conduct international transactions, those transactions flow through systems ultimately controlled by American authorities. SWIFT, the messaging system that enables international wire transfers, is technically Belgian, but it operates under American jurisdiction when dollar transactions are involved. American banks, American clearinghouses, American regulatory agencies can monitor, delay, or block European transactions with the stroke of a pen. The sanctions on Russia demonstrated this power dramatically. European companies found themselves unable to conduct previously legal business not because European law prohibited it, but because American law prohibited it, and American law governed the financial infrastructure they depended upon. European energy companies couldn't pay for Russian gas. European manufacturers couldn't buy Russian materials. European banks couldn't process routine commercial transactions. The United States had effectively weaponized the global financial system, and Europe was as vulnerable to this weapon as anyone else. But why don't Europeans build alternative systems? They've tried repeatedly. The EU created Instex to facilitate trade with Iran without using dollar-denominated channels. The results were embarrassingly modest. A few million euros in humanitarian transactions, while tens of billions in normal trade remained frozen. They've discussed creating European alternatives to SWIFT, European clearing systems, European payment networks. These discussions produce reports and committees and working groups, but little actual infrastructure. The reason is simple. Building alternative systems requires accepting short-term costs for long-term independence, and European political systems are optimized for avoiding short-term costs. Consider what genuine monetary independence would require. European companies would need to abandon dollar-based transactions, accepting higher costs, and reduce liquidity in the short term. European banks would need to reduce their exposure to American financial markets, limiting their global reach. European consumers would pay higher prices for goods and services as supply chains reorganized around non-dollar systems. These costs aren't theoretical. China has been building alternative systems for years, creating the cross-border interbank payment system, expanding the use of the yuan in international trade, establishing swap agreements with dozens of countries. But China is an authoritarian state that can impose short-term sacrifices on its population without electoral consequences. European democracies face voters every few years, voters who judge their leaders based on immediate economic conditions, not long-term strategic positions. This creates what I call the sovereignty trap. Democratic politicians who pursue policies that threaten American interests face immediate economic retaliation that voters will punish at the next election. Politicians who accommodate American interests avoid immediate costs but perpetuate long-term dependence. The rational short-term choice for European politicians is always accommodation, regardless of the long-term costs to European sovereignty. The defense dimension reinforces this dynamic. NATO isn't just a military alliance, it's an institutional framework that makes European defense planning dependent on American preferences. European armies use American equipment, follow American doctrines, integrate with American command structures. This integration brings real benefits: shared intelligence, interoperability, access to advanced American technology, but it also brings real costs: inability to pursue independent foreign policies, vulnerability to American pressure, dependence on American approval for major security decisions. When France opposed the Iraq War in 2003, American retaliation was swift and comprehensive. French companies were excluded from reconstruction contracts. French diplomatic initiatives were blocked or undermined. French military cooperation with the United States was curtailed. The message was clear: independence has consequences, and those consequences will be felt across multiple dimensions simultaneously. European leaders learned the lesson. When the United States launched regime change operations in Libya, European nations provided crucial support despite obvious parallels to Iraq. When America expanded NATO eastward despite Russian objections, European nations went along despite obvious risks to their energy security. When the United States confronted China over trade and technology, European nations aligned themselves with Washington despite massive Chinese markets for European goods. But the deepest level of dependence isn't economic or military, it's intellectual. European elites are educated in American universities, work for American companies, internalize American assumptions about how the world works. The revolving door between European institutions and American organizations ensures that European decision-making is staffed by people whose careers depend on maintaining good relationships with American power centers. I experienced this personally during my time in government. European officials who privately acknowledged the destructive nature of austerity policies would publicly defend them because those policies had American backing. European economists who understood the flaws in American financial regulation would recommend adopting it because American approval was necessary for European banks to operate globally. European politicians who recognized the risks of American foreign policy adventures would support them because opposition carried unacceptable costs. This isn't conspiracy, it's structural dependency. When your career prospects, your institutional funding, your international credibility depend on American approval, you internalize American priorities as your own. You begin to see American interests as universal interests, American preferences as objective necessities, American power as natural law. The result is what political scientists call hegemonic stability, but which I prefer to call hegemonic capture. The dominated don't simply submit to the dominator, they become convinced that domination serves their interests. They begin to police themselves to anticipate the dominator's preferences, to compete with each other for the dominator's approval. This dynamic is visible across European policy making. When the United States expressed concern about Chinese investment in European infrastructure, European nations began restricting Chinese acquisitions before America demanded it. When Washington signaled displeasure with Russian energy exports, European countries started reducing their energy dependence before sanctions required it. European self-censorship became more effective than American pressure because it avoided the political costs of visible subordination. Brexit represented a partial escape from this dynamic, but only partial. Britain left the European Union partly to escape Brussels-based constraints on its sovereignty, but it immediately discovered that escaping European integration meant accepting even greater dependence on the United States. Post-Brexit trade negotiations revealed that Britain's bargaining power outside Europe was dramatically reduced. American companies gained greater access to British markets. American regulatory standards became British regulatory standards. British foreign policy aligned even more closely with American preferences. The lesson wasn't lost on other Europeans contemplating independence. Leaving American-led institutions doesn't automatically increase sovereignty if you lack the economic and military power to maintain independence alone. This brings us to the central paradox of European integration. The European project was conceived as a way to pool sovereignty in order to enhance it, to create an entity large enough to negotiate with the United States and other great powers as equals. But the institutions created to pool sovereignty have themselves become mechanisms of American influence. The European Central Bank follows Fed policies with minimal lag. European telecommunications companies adopt American security standards. European tax authorities cooperate with American revenue collection. European courts enforce American sanctions. The more integrated Europe becomes, the more efficiently American preferences are transmitted throughout the continent. Yet alternatives exist, and they're not merely theoretical. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization demonstrates that major powers can cooperate without American involvement. The Belt and Road Initiative shows that massive infrastructure projects can be financed and implemented outside dollar-dominated systems. BRICS nations increasingly settle trade in their own currencies. Regional development banks provide financing without IMF conditionality. These alternatives aren't perfect. They have their own problems, their own dependencies, their own constraints. But they prove that the current system isn't inevitable, that other arrangements are possible, that American hegemony isn't a law of nature, but a political choice that can be reversed. The question is whether Europeans are willing to pay the price for genuine independence. That price isn't just economic, it's political and cultural as well. It means accepting that European interests sometimes diverge from American interests. It means building institutions that can function without American approval. It means developing military capabilities that don't depend on American technology. It means creating educational and cultural institutions that produce European perspectives rather than recycling American ones. Most fundamentally, it means abandoning the comfortable illusion that European subordination is actually partnership, that American leadership serves European interests, that the current system is both inevitable and beneficial. I don't know if Europeans are capable of making these changes. 70 years of dependence have created powerful constituencies for continuation of the current system. European companies profit from access to American markets. European financial institutions benefit from their role in dollar-dominated systems. European politicians build their careers on managing relationships with Washington rather than challenging them. But I do know that the current trajectory is unsustainable. American power is declining relative to China and other emerging economies. American domestic politics are increasingly unstable. American commitment to the liberal international order is increasingly conditional. The system that has provided Europe with security and prosperity for 70 years is approaching its limits. When that system breaks down, and it will break down, Europe will face the choice it has been avoiding since 1945. It can accept subordination to whatever power emerges to replace American hegemony, or it can finally build the independent institutions necessary for genuine sovereignty. The longer Europe waits to make that choice, the fewer options it will have when the moment arrives. But as long as European leaders remain convinced that the current system serves their interests, as long as European populations remain unaware of the costs of dependence, as long as European institutions remain captured by American priorities, that choice will continue to be deferred. This isn't a story about American villainy or European weakness. It's a story about how hegemonic systems perpetuate themselves, how dependence becomes self-reinforcing, how intelligent people can collectively choose subordination because independence seems too expensive. But it's also a story about possibilities, because if Europe ever decides that sovereignty is worth the price, it has the resources to achieve it. The question is whether it has the will.